If you get a modern economics textbook, in the first chapter it used to talk about a barter community and money being developed to reduce transaction costs. But when you ask archaeologists or anthropologists, they'll say it's never happened, not even once, ever in human history, nowhere.
Ever wondered about the origin of money and how our economy really works? This episode is just for you.
The role of the government is not to balance its budget. It's not to run a surplus. Instead, it's to target things like a transition towards a sustainable future.
Stephen Hale is an economist with a radical perspective. He's about to challenge everything you thought you knew about the economy.
The way the monetary system works is the spending comes first and then taxation and borrowing comes later. The way most people think it works, they think the government has to tax and borrow and then can only spend what it's taxed or borrowed. Functionally, that's the wrong way around.
Stephen takes us on a historical journey, debunking the myth of the barter system as the origin of money and revealing a different narrative that traces back thousands of years.
People didn't used to trade for basic necessities. Food was shared. There was no question as a result of somebody not being particularly productive. That's not how societies used to work.
Stephen explores the surprising connection that links the ancient temples and armies to the birth of money.
Food surpluses allowed for the development of the earliest versions of organised religion. The first step, if you want to be a currency issuer, is to impose a tax liability on the population. Now, the earliest tax liabilities were assessed in weights of barley related to the daily ration of a soldier. But you could actually pay your taxes to anything that the temple would find useful.
Turns out these ancient concepts have present-day consequences. We never look at interest rates and inflation the same way again. This episode comes with a content warning. Stephen dives into some pretty complex economic terminology that might have you scratching your head. You'll hear me jump in where I can to clarify, but this episode might have you hitting the rewind button. If you haven't listened to part 1 of my chat with Stephen, hit pause and go back there now. It's episode 11 in season 1. In that episode, we talk in lots more detail about ecological economics and donut economics. Make a mental note for this episode. Anytime Stephen says MMT, he's referring to modern monetary theory. So MMT is an alternative view to neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics is what's taught around the world as the dominant narrative of how the economy works today. But it's important to remember, it's just a theory. So make a cup of coffee, get that pause button ready, and let's jump in. What is the 20th century model of economics?
It's based on the idea that you can represent the economy as though it's a highly stable general equilibrium system. Think of the economy as though it's a barter system where we all have endowments of skills and other resources. We trade with each other. We have the power to choose in what occupation we're going to work and for how many hours we're going to work. The amount we get paid depends on how productive we are. So if you're not highly paid, it's your fault, really. And the financial system efficiently values assets like shares in companies. Capitalism is a stable and doesn't have an inherent tendency towards instability, towards boom and bust. And that's been the dominant tradition in economics for the last 40 years. There have always been other ways of thinking about the economy, and within those other ways, which are often described something other than orthodox, ecological economics, which says capitalism has a tendency towards moving outside our planetary boundaries and undermining the health of our environment, and modern monetary theory, which says that neoclassical economics continues to misrepresent how monetary systems actually work and the appropriate role for governments within monetary systems.
So what does modern monetary theory have to say about landing somewhere within that donut?
The story in neoclassical economics is that we all once lived in barter communities and there were transaction costs. Somehow people within communities started to use a commodity as a generally accepted medium of exchange. So you got round what people sometimes call the double coincidence of wants problem, and this allowed for more specialization and division of labor and the beginnings of economic development. There's nothing wrong logically with that story, but when you ask archaeologists or anthropologists about it, they'll say it's never happened, not even once, ever in human history, nowhere. It's not correct. What actually happened is something rather different. What actually happened was that more than 5,000 years ago, but less than 10,000 years ago, up until then, people had lived generally in communities of 100 to 150 people, and everybody within those communities basically was involved in gathering food or hunting. There were no food surpluses. It was about getting enough food to survive. Although people may have used what sometimes are described as primitive currencies to hold society together. So if there's a wedding, then there'd be gifts. If I injured your brother, then my family would have to pay your brother compensation. When we met other tribes in our area as an alternative to war, there'd be bargain for the sorts of things that we tended to. Maybe we're particularly good at producing spears and they're particularly good at ceremonial mats, and we trade them. But people didn't used to trade for basic necessities. Food was shared. There was no question as a result of somebody not being particularly productive. That's not how societies used to work. Before 5,000 years ago, there were food surpluses in the Middle East. And food surpluses allowed for the development of the earliest versions of organized religion. Temple communities developed. Within those temple communities, there were people working who were not involved in food provision. Instead, they were being fed out of the surpluses, which now existed for the first time. Those temple communities also had attached to them the earliest armies. And that's where, you're talking about expansion and war and fighting for territory. No, not until then, actually. That's when that got going.
How did the food surplus enable that?
Without a food surplus, you can't have people doing anything other than contributing towards food production. So you can't support soldiers, priests, public servants. You've got to provision them, means developing accounting. And the accounting of provisioning for these communities is where the development of numeracy and literacy came from. It's also where tax was invented. In MMT, we say currencies are that which is necessary to pay taxes. By imposing a tax liability, you create a demand for your currency. Now, the earliest tax liabilities were assessed in weights of barley related to the daily ration of a soldier. But you could actually pay your taxes or your tributes in a wide variety of things, anything that the temple would find useful. But what happened very early on was the development of what we now regard as fiat money and debt contracts.
So a quick definition from me here. Fiat money is a type of currency that's not backed by a commodity. So it's got no intrinsic value or any use value. Think about the piece of plastic or the coin or the piece of paper in your wallet. It of itself doesn't have any value. It only has a value because we as an economy have all agreed that it's got a certain value. It's really just a token, and that's what Stephen refers to as a unit of account. And that gives us a standard measure that we can use for tax reasons.
Once you've got a unit of account, and the unit of account historically has, and this is something that the Bitcoin people got wrong, the unit of account historically has always been the unit of account which the tax collecting authority, the government, has stipulated. If your taxes are measured in a particular unit of account, in Australia it's Australian dollars, then it makes sense for the Australian dollar to be the unit of account that's used generally, because that tax liability is something that we are all subject to. Then you can issue tax anticipation notices, which can actually trade as fiat currency. In the earliest communities, we are talking about clay tablets. Hazelwood tally sticks played this function. Of course, historically, we're most familiar with coins, but no coins were actually minted until less than 3,000 years ago. Money tokens existed for 2,000 years before the development of the earliest coins. Coinage did not play a role in the very ancient history of money because coins didn't exist. Let's jump thousands of years, because we haven't got all day, to talk about the British Empire in the late 19th century. The British Empire in the late 19th century invading Ghana. How do you persuade people in a pre-monetary society to come and work for you if you're not going to enslave them all, if you're not going to use force? You impose a tax liability. You say, you have to pay us a taxation. The only thing we're going to accept to pay your taxes is these coins with Queen Victoria's head on. If you don't pay your taxes, we're going to demolish your hut. How are you going to pay your taxes? You don't have any coins with Queen Victoria's head on. Well, here's a way you can pay your taxes. You can come and work for us. You can grow food, or you can build things. You can construct roads. We'll pay you and you can take some of what we pay you and you can use it to pay back your taxes. This is how modern monetary systems work. As far as currency issuance is concerned, the first step is to impose a tax liability on the population. That creates a demand for your currency with the power of the state as that which is necessary to pay taxes. What you can then do, of course, is you can spend that currency into existence. So at one level, it's about enforcing part of the private sector to provide goods and services or labour to the state. And the other macroeconomic role of taxation is to limit the ability of the private sector to spend so that total spending in the economy remains within the productive capacity. So you don't have the government and private sector competing for scarce resources and driving up prices and causing inflation.
So the you in that is the government. So the government can spend on building or food or whatever it needs and issue its currency.
That is the history of currency issuance. So you can see how that's different to the mainstream story. This is shifting a bit. If you get a modern economics textbook, in the first chapter, it used to talk about a barter community and money being developed to reduce transaction costs. They don't say that anymore. Instead, they say, imagine people lived in a barter community. And the reason why they don't say it anymore is because everybody outside economics has been saying for the last century there is no evidence whatsoever that that's ever happened. Money is not something that the private sector develops. Money is something that was invented by the earliest governments. That's not to say that historically gold and other commodities have not played an important role in monetary systems. Their main role in ancient history was in international trade. If you were in the Roman Empire, then the tax collecting power of the Roman Empire played a role in maintaining the value of the coinage. And indeed, if the value in exchange of the coinage was not greater than the intrinsic value of the gold in the currency would be melted down anyway. It was. And in everyday coins people used were base metal anyway. They didn't have any gold in them. So the only value that they had was based on the fact that somebody needed to get them in order to pay taxes. Before you and I can pay taxes, the government has to spend dollars into the system. And this works even today because at the federal level, all taxes in the end are paid using funds in our bank's exchange settlement account reserves at the RBA. And there's only two ways for those reserves to be created. Those reserves are created when the federal government spends, when the RBA organises that spending as the fiscal agent of the federal government, or when the RBA buys those things it's allowed to buy from the private sector, which generally speaking is financial assets, government securities on the secondary market, which is what happened during the pandemic. The RBA did that big time. So Stephanie Kelton, the author of the other great book that people should read, it was a New York Times bestseller called The Deficit Myth, explained this very clearly in those book. The way the monetary system works is the spending comes first and then taxation and borrowing comes later. That's the STAB acronym. That's the way our monetary system works. The way most people think it works is the other way around. They think it's the TAB system. They think the government has to tax and borrow and then can only spend what it's taxed or borrowed. Functionally, that's the wrong way around when you look at our monetary system. Now, all sorts of important things that come out of that, but the most important insight is the problem with an excessive level of federal spending is inflation. It's not insolvency. I can guarantee to the people listening to us now that given the way Australia's monetary system is organised today, there will never be a fiscal crisis in Australia, which is the result of our government running out of its own currency. That's because our federal government is not only a currency issuer, it also has a very high degree of what we call monetary sovereignty. To be a full monetary sovereign, you have to issue your own currency, and that currency is the unit of account in which people's taxes are collected. But you also need to have no commitment to exchange the currency at a fixed price for any commodity or any foreign currency that you can run out of. So you can't have a fixed exchange rate. Australia has not had a fixed exchange rate since 1983. And the government must have no significant foreign currency denominated debt. It helps if you also have a resilient economy which will function well regardless of fluctuations in the exchange rate. If you've got $50 in your bank, all you're guaranteed with that $50 is you can use it to pay $50 of your taxes. If I've got a $50 note, the only guarantee I've got is I can take it to the RBA and they'll give me a new $50 note to replace it with. Nobody's going to give me a fixed amount of gold. It is never the case that the Australian Commonwealth government cannot afford to buy anything which it wants to buy, which is for sale in Australian dollars. Just to give you an idea of why this is important, between the financial crisis and the pandemic, we had a higher level of unemployment than we needed to have had in Australia for years and years, and we delayed making investments. For example, investments in green infrastructure, including moving more quickly to renewables. And part of the reason which was given for this was that the government in its budget papers every year said its target was to run a fiscal surplus on average, that this was necessary to ensure that we could respond to a downturn or a crisis when one happened. Actually, they at no stage managed to run a fiscal surplus. This is not surprising because since federation, 90% of the time, the broadly defined government sector in Australia has been in deficit. We've had hardly any fiscal surpluses. Almost the only years this has ever happened is 8 out of 10 years of the Howard government, which is when household debt trebled in Australia, so it wasn't such a great period. And for a couple of years when Paul Keating was the Treasurer. Other than that, Australian governments have habitually been in deficit. The reason for this is that deficits and surpluses cancel out across the monetary system, and it is normal for the private sector to want to be in surplus, to save Australian dollars. And those dollars have to come from somewhere. And the only place they can come from, unless you have a big trade surplus, is the government sector. If you look at high-income countries around the world, every single year forever, on average, governments run deficits because the private sector wants to run surpluses. If you try and run a surplus, the trouble is that weakens the private sector. The economy is not as strong as it would otherwise be. You end up paying more out in job seeker than you might have anticipated and getting far less tax receipts than you might have expected. So you end up running a deficit anyway, which happens year after year after year. If you understand the monetary system, you understand that the role of the government is not to balance its budget. It's not to run a surplus. Instead, it's to target things like a transition towards a sustainable future economy and meantime to think about inflation risk. That's what they should be reporting on every year. So it just changes your perceptions of what's important and what the role of the government is. And that's where MMT and ecological economics fit together. In the long run, we're going to have to be quite tight as far as the government budget is concerned because we're not going to be growing the economy indefinitely. But in the short run, it is about managing what will be a period where the economy is expanding because we need, for example, you need excellent public transport before people use their cars less. You need the renewable energy before you shut down the fossil fuel power stations. We need to manage a period of expansion where we're going to eat into our ecological budget, but we shouldn't be scared of running fiscal deficits during this period. It's about looking at how you deal with inflation risk. And that's where issues like credit regulation in the private sector have a role to play, non-fiscal pay-fors. If we do have inflation risk, as we've had in the last couple of years, you need to look at what's contributing to that. And just saying, oh, we need government spending cuts, or even just saying we need higher interest rates to deal with the inflation might not be the appropriate way of thinking. Politicians and economists have to become a bit more intelligent. And we mustn't just say inflation's a bit high, therefore interest rates rise next month. No, why is inflation a bit high? Nobody ever reverts to the mainstream view once they understand the modern monetary theory view of the system, which is why it's spreading so quickly.
Hey, it's Joe here. I hope you're enjoying the episode. Every chat in season 1 of The Thought Follower is very different. I've talked to creatives, economists, elite athletes, CEOs, venture capitalists, and a bunch more along the way. You never quite know what you're going to get, so make sure you subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts and make sure you don't miss an episode. Let's get back to the chat. From a layperson's view, without knowing what MMT is or was, or necessarily even knowing what neoclassical economics is, the layperson in Australia, particularly at the moment, is feeling something's out of whack.
Absolutely.
I want to elaborate on what I mean here by something feels out of whack. People are working harder, groceries are costing more, your coffee costs $5. Even though we're working harder than ever, we don't seem to be able to get ahead. Through COVID, we know that billions of dollars were wiped off the economy. Lots of people lost their jobs, but somehow house prices keep going up. And so the next 7 minutes of this podcast, Stephen gives a very quick overview as to why Australian property is so fucking expensive at the moment.
Well, the first thing that we should have done is we shouldn't be in this position. It's partly through misunderstanding the monetary system. And bizarrely, everybody, including the Labour Party, treats the Howard Costello government as though it was the height of fiscal responsibility, when actually that's where our household debt comes from. Because on our monetary system, for every net lender, there's a net borrower. The government is a net lender on the system when it's running a surplus. The rest of the world was a net lender. That means the private sector's net borrowing. It was mainly households borrowing to drive up house prices. And actually, our banking regulator, APRA, and the central bank, the RBA, and the Treasurer as well, they were all encouraging this. In the early 1990s, Australia had one of the lowest levels of household debt to GDP amongst all the OECD countries. By 2010, we were, I think, second only to Switzerland in terms of household debt. And we trebled our household debt to GDP ratio, and it's slightly higher figure. Sometimes you see household debt to disposable income also. We trebled that too. Household debt to disposable income went from 60% to 180%, basically within one government. And that's where our house price bubble got going as well. People used to talk about the Australian economy riding on the sheep's back. In the early 2000s, the Australian economy rode on the housing back. It rode on the back of growing household debt. And of course, if you're already in the property market, your wealth is inflated. If you're prepared to downscale, you can release a lot of equity. Where's that equity coming from? It's coming from other households borrowing from the banking system, driving the price up.
Your old house.
And a neglect of this by our regulators, just allowing it to happen. But this was essential because if the government is determined to drive fiscal policy towards a surplus, somebody has to do the deficit spending. It was something which was allowed to happen, influenced by a neoclassical perspective, because the neoclassical story is you're a rational individual. Nonsense. But that nonsense has got us to where we are now. As far as where we are now is concerned, there are radical economists like Steve King, who's quite well known, who are in favour of some kind of debt jubilee. Basically, the federal government, which could afford to do so, taking on some of that household debt onto its own balance sheet. I'm not 100% with him there necessarily, although that's one idea.
We have that through things like the 5%, some of these first home buyer schemes and things. That is essentially...
Well, no, that's adding fuel to the fire. That shouldn't be called a first home buyer scheme. It should be called a selling a house to a first home buyer scheme, because that just puts upward pressure on prices. But what that is a sign of is that we've got ourselves into this situation where no Australian government can tolerate downward pressure on the property market. So they will do absolutely anything to avoid a housing crash, because it would be catastrophic and a guarantee that you'd be wiped out at the next election. That's where we're at. And so every time we've expected a downturn, something has happened. Governments have found one way or another of stopping it. And more recently, APRA helped to stop it by having introduced, very sensibly, limits on investment-only mortgages and interest-only mortgages. During the pandemic, they eliminated those limits again. So we have a prudential regulator that now sees it as part of its job not to regulate credit creation from a financial stability point of view, but also to loosen things up to support this housing market because of where we've got to. Now, if I was in charge, we wouldn't be having a housing future fund. We would be having a major investment in public housing. We sold off our public housing. We didn't replace the public housing. Instead, we booked it state government level as limiting state government debt, basically. Sold off the family silver. I think the important thing from an affordable housing point of view is that we need to have public housing more available again, as we used to do in previous decades, much more widely available. Not the same as before, not the same kind of housing as before, but people need to have an affordable alternative. That helps to put a cap on rents in the private rental sector if people have an affordable alternative. That helps to put a cap on people seeing investments in property as a good way of saving and getting a return, because that's not really the function of property. The function of property should be people having somewhere affordable to live and to have a good quality of life. It shouldn't be a speculative asset. That's an unhealthy way to be.
I want to interrupt Stephen again here, because this was probably the biggest light bulb moment in my talks with him. I listened to that bit again. The function of property
should be people having somewhere affordable to live and to have a good quality of life. It shouldn't be a speculative asset.
It's not a speculative asset. That, for me, is the change in thinking. Particularly in Australia, we view property as this speculative asset that becomes your nest egg, that becomes your retirement. And that's kind of fundamentally not how it should be. Anyway, I'll let Stephen finish off.
If there's a downturn in the property market, we need to concentrate on maintaining full employment so that people are not faced at the same time with negative equity on their homes and an inability to service their mortgages because they've lost their jobs. And people like me who think that we've got the role of interest rates in our economy, it's much more complicated than people imagine. And sometimes we've got that the wrong way round. Even interest rate cuts can sometimes push inflation down, and I think that was happening before the pandemic. And interest rate increases have a complicated effect on the economy. There's no simple link between inflation and interest rates. I don't think we should be messing about with interest rates. It'll be much easier to do this if the US does it as well. But I think interest rates should be basically low and stable. Low, stable interest rates, affordable housing, investments in public housing. I'm perfectly happy if there's public sector housing investments not to be trying to bribe people if we have fewer private landlords, well, as long as people have an alternative. That doesn't matter so much. But yes, it's difficult to get all these things done. And some of it goes back to, first of all, an understanding of an interest in how the monetary system works, and not taking how we do things at the moment for granted as the only way of doing things. And there's also a link back to ecological economics as well, because part of the donut is making sure people have access to decent, affordable, sustainable housing.
Stephen, thank you so much for all that insight. Thank you so much for joining the show.
That's all right, no worries.
Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to support me or the show, best way is to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And please get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Love to hear from you with any guest recommendations or feedback on the show. See you on the next one.